This is the XrmToolCast from CRM Audio with Business Applications MVPs Daryl Labar and Jonas Rapp. The podcast focused on tools available for the Microsoft Business Application Platform. This episode is brought to you by Mapltyics by Inogic. Mapltyics by Inogic is a market-leading certified for Microsoft Dynamics 365 geoanalytical mapping app. Mapltyics empowers users with powerful map visualizations and routing capabilities within Dynamics CRM to drive better sales, improve business processes, and engage the right customers at the right time. Mapltyics now works with Dynamics 365 version 9 and Dynamics 365 app for mobile and tablet. We thank Mapltyics by Inogic for sponsoring an XrmToolCast from CRM Audio.
Welcome to episode 6 of the XrmToolCast with your host, me, Daryl, always raising the bar, and Jonas rapping the rap. Is that how that works, Jonas?
Yeah, that works for me, thanks.
So this is probably going to be the nerdiest that we'll ever get in this podcast, because this podcast is all about a particular GitHub issue for the XrmToolBox. What GitHub issue number was that again, Jonas?
833, look it up.
833. So if you want to look it up and follow around with us nerds, go ahead and check that out on the XrmToolBox GitHub site, issue 833. So we brought our guest today, and our guest is Marc Schweigert. If I got that name halfway close, if you need to correct me, feel free to. But Marc, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, you were close enough. It's Marc Schweigert. I am I guess publicly, I call myself the Global Sales Director for Power Apps and Flow internally. I'm the worldwide workload lead for Power Apps and Flow in corporate sales. So my role is sort of to sit between sales, marketing, product engineering, our partner organizations, and really ensure that the sales organization can successfully sell Power Apps and Flow through all the things that need to be coordinated across product engineering, marketing, partner engagement, etc. And so that's my role. I always like to caveat when I say I'm in sales that I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will. I like to still think of myself as a technical guy. I'm a C++ developer by trade, turned a .NET developer, a VB developer into a COM+ developer, into a .NET developer, into an Azure developer. Learned about this whole thing called XRM back in the CRM 2011 days, and kind of got what I would call low-code religion well before lots of people have. And then as Power Apps and XRM were merging, I'd kind of left the XRM space and I was focused on Azure again. And as I found out internally that Power Apps and XRM were merging, I certainly wanted back in because I was a big believer in the potential and seeing the two of those come together, or the thought and the idea that those two would come together really excited me. So I got back into the what we now call the Power Platform space, which led me into this role.
Wow. So you say you are a developer and you are some way related to marketing, so you know that naming is hard.
I do know that naming is hard, yes.
Yeah, from both angles there.
And I'm well aware of the sort of the age-old Microsoft joke that we change naming just enough to continue to confuse our customers.
Yeah, you sure are succeeding at that.
Yeah.
So, what brought us to bring you on the show was this GitHub issue. You posed a question earlier this year around the name of XrmToolBox, and could you give us sort of the gist of that question and maybe some background to that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And as if anybody who reads the back and forth on the GitHub issue, will see, perhaps the question itself was flawed because the intent was not as much about, hey, we need to rename this to something else. It was about the experience that I'm running into, having been somebody who lived in the XRM world for a long time, who's now talking to customers about what we used to call XRM as model-driven Power Apps and the Common Data Service, and more broadly talking about the Power Platform and how these technologies are part of the broader Power Platform. And to this point of the confusion it causes, because naming is hard and changing of names is hard. And it's hard in one respect for Dynamics folks to get used to this name, and then in another respect, it's hard when new customers who just know the Power Platform, Power Apps, Canvas, model-driven CDS terminology are then explained that this technology came from Dynamics and based on something we used to call XRM, and there's a bunch of these great tools out there, but if you don't know the term XRM, you don't know that these tools apply to you, right? And so it's really the conversation, really the sort of the core of the conversation was really about how can we get those who don't know the term XRM to realize if they're doing Power Apps and CDS, that this amazing set of tools in XrmToolBox are tools that will help make their lives better. And I can tell you from my experience, when I do that with customers, I get a blank stare because they don't connect the dots between Power Apps and CDS to XrmToolBox being this amazing tool that they can use to solve hard problems.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those guys that came from CRM, started in 4.0, and when Microsoft launched this XRM concept, I was like, this is what it's all about. So I still tend to think about it as, well, you say CDS, Power, whatever, I call it XRM. So, and I guess being a bit sentimental, it's easy to stick to that as well. But I totally understand that when you're coming from the outside, it really doesn't make any sense at all.
From a developer perspective, XRM is such a good name for it, though. I mean, it's anything relational, and
yeah, no,
we like our X's and naming things too. So that's the heart wrench of, oh, it's such a good name, and then I'll do air quotes. Marketing had to come in and give it a different name here, but yeah.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about that, right? So,
okay.
And the names will remain anonymous, but many years ago, I was in an internal meeting at Microsoft where we had made this shift towards at least from a corporate marketing perspective, to not focus on XRM and focus more on the first-party capabilities of Dynamics CRM and Dynamics 365. And I come from the world of U.S. Public sector, so selling to the U.S. government, right? And the reality is that the majority of what we've always done in terms of convincing customers to rationalize using this technology it has been not first-party applications. It's been to realize that that they can build their own domain-specific applications on top of this extensibility framework that's embedded into Dynamics, what used to be CRM, and then eventually 365, right, which we affectionately call XRM. And so we were in this meeting with some folks. We were having this heated debate about, let's not focus on XRM. And one of the folks on my team, very passionately said something to the effect of, you realize that the word XRM is in all the APIs. And so we can't stop using the term XRM because it's there, right? And it is what it is. And it was like one of these blank stares, because obviously the person that we were talking to didn't really, have the depth of the knowledge of APIs, right? They were talking about branding and positioning and all that sort of thing. But it's a real challenge, because until some point in the future when APIs change, you can't get away from the term XRM. It's there.
Yeah. At least from the developer community, that would be. I mean, not the customers don't really see what the DLLs are called, and so.
That's right.
And I have actually a very similar story, but from the opposite end. I had some colleagues, and the same way, no names are mentioned here, that were discussing whether or not to do this CDS thing. And they had all these pros and cons, and then I asked them, okay, which version are you on? Yeah, we're on 9.1. Okay, you have CDS. It is CDS. Oh, so they had a complete misconception of what is CDS.
Yeah, and I think this goes to this whole theme of change is hard, right? And no matter how many times you try to explain to people that that every Microsoft first-party application that is based on what we think of as Dynamics 365 customer engagement is a model-driven Power App written, running on top of the Common Data Service. It just happens to be a model-driven Power App running on top of the common data service that Microsoft has built as a first-party application and sells, right? Just like any customer can build their own model-driven Power App on top of the common data service, and ISVs can build their own model-driven Power App on top of the common data service. And now, right, which is I think what a lot of people in the community who are passionate about XRM wanted, now you can actually do it by buying a non-Dynamics license to enable you to do that.
Yeah.
And it is something that even internally at Microsoft, it's, not everybody gets that. The light bulb hasn't gone off, and is, the only way, to this point of branding and, naming is hard. The only way you kind of get through something like this is with time and repetition.
Yeah, yeah, it's the chicken and the egg problem, because the whole goal, I think, was to build a rapid application development platform. And when I first got into CRM, it kind of a bad stigma from other developers that I knew, because it was like, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that, and you can't use all the shiny new tools and all this, all this kind of stigma that was kind of attached to it. But then once I started working in it, I was like, oh wait, this is awesome. I mean, I don't have to spend my life creating a new login form every single time for every single new application that I'm on. It's already built, like all this stuff's already built in, and I don't have to come in and have to learn whatever their particular methodology for accessing their data access layer, whatever they're using for. I don't have to learn something new each client that I go on. I can just go in and know all that stuff and just focus on the business. Like, this is awesome. And I can hire people that already have those skills that I don't have to train everything on, and they just need to learn the business part. This is an awesome idea and an awesome way of creating this rapid application development platform. But then it's stuck with how do we sell that? How do we get people to use it and get that snowball going? And so that's where I think the push really came from. Hey, we need to have a first party app that we can actually sell it sitting on top of this, and so they kind of go back and forth, where that focus is on the actual sellable part of it and on the actual XRM part of it. So.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how what's old is new, right?
Yep. So I'm going to go ahead and read the very first their very first question that you did for this issue, and it says, given that what we used to call XRM is now model-driven apps and CDS, have you thought about renaming the tool? So Mark, the question is for you: if you had a magic wand and you can go and rename it, and keeping in mind that renaming things is hard, and you can rename the tool, what would you name it today? What would you call it?
I would call it the Power Platform Toolbox. And the reason I would call it the Power Platform Toolbox is because there's already tools in there for Power BI, right? There's tools in there for CDS and model-driven apps. The fact that Canvas apps, Flow, custom connectors, and configuration parameters are being brought into the CDS solution packaging system, right, means that automatically those technologies are now benefit from these tools. And I suspect as the Power Platform continues to get momentum, continues to sort of grow with the momentum that it's seeing, there will be more and more tools that are more applicable to that brand versus just sort of more narrowly what we think of as XRM. But I think time will tell as the community grows, how many other tools that sort of address those things become available. I've heard, from others that there have been requests around, more Power BI kind of capabilities and other capabilities. So if it gravitates towards that direction, then I would suggest maybe Power Platform Toolbox. But again, this is the guy who's saying, both naming is hard, and I at the same time, I don't know that I'm, there's a reason I'm not in marketing and branding as a role, right? Because I would probably come up with, the classic Microsoft branding, old age joke, which is, five words with a year and then an R2, R3, CTP1 kind of concept, because it's easier to do than create something that catches from a brand perspective.
Yeah. Another aspect where I think two things that struck me in this discussion. First is, of course, there's of course validity to your question, because it does so much more than XRM. The other side of it, I'm still amazed whenever people, especially from Microsoft, come and have opinions about this little playground that we have as just a sort of volunteer community-driven efforts. I think it's amazing that it's so much recognized within Microsoft that you even have opinions or requests for naming of the tool.
Well, I mean, I think it's just for lack of a better word, a testament to, the value of the tool, right? I mean, most people who at Microsoft that I know anyway that are think of them as XRM folks, view XrmToolBox as an indispensable tool, and almost all of them have conversations with their customers about the tool when you need to go do advanced things that we don't necessarily make easy out of the box in our product, right? And frankly, that if you look at community tools across the industry, that's generally what community tools do, right? They provide that sort of added thing that the core product or open source project doesn't necessarily do. And I think XrmToolBox is a shining example of that.
Yeah,
I think that speaks also to Microsoft's commitment in the last, just the paradigm shift that they've had in the last probably 10 years here, where it's so much of it is API driven, open API driven, where they're encouraging you to fill in the gaps the best way you see fit. And they're encouraging you to write the PowerShells to do it. They're encouraging you to write the API calls to do it and be able to do that. And it's very exciting to be able to at least have that. And we keep on asking for more. Like, hey, the tools that you're giving within the SDK, we'd like to be able to change those and have our hands on those as well. So yeah, that's an interesting paradigm that they've shifted to.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been at Microsoft for 15 years now, and I started off as what we used to call a app dev pre-sales engineer, what we call TSP now, and my focus was the .NET framework, BizTalk server, and SQL Server. And then I became a .NET evangelist. I spent the largest chunk outside of Dynamics and now Power Platform in a group that used to be called Developer and Platform Evangelism. And so I kind of grew up with Microsoft experimenting in, first shared source and then eventually getting to open source and really kind of evolving as a company to where we are today in sort of this theme that you're describing. And for me, it's interesting because I've been so ingrained in this evolution at Microsoft well before most people realized it was even going on, that I often have to kind of reflect on the fact and acknowledge that still today, not everybody realizes how much we've evolved sort of philosophically as a company. And in fact, when I was in Azure, focused on Azure as an Azure Cloud Solution Architect before I came back to what we now call Power Platform, I was so surprised at how many people still did not realize how much we've embraced sort of openness and open source as a company, and didn't believe that Azure, for example, was a legitimate platform for the open source community. And so it was always fun to kind of get people to open their eyes to that and realize it. So I can certainly appreciate that perspective.
So one of the ending conversations that we kind of had at the end of the issue, or at least the one that's currently there, which has the most upvotes, by the way, because I wrote it. But it's kind of a thinking about what's the next evolution of the XrmToolBox. It started off just being a way of managing your connections, managing your passwords, and giving yourself an iOrganization service that's ready to communicate to CRM. Like that was at its base. That's what it was, and that's all it provided. And today we're in a world where it's doing so much more that isn't related at all to the iOrganization service. And I mean, we have tons of plugins that are in there just because of the ease of use of the community knowing that these tools are out there and being able to just plug it in. I mean, the last tool that I wrote, the Visual Studio Solution Accelerator, there's no interaction between that and CRM. It's specifically for generating plugins for CRM. But then even the BI stuff you're talking about too, a lot of that stuff isn't necessarily interacting directly with CRM either. And so it's almost like we kind of have to grow up a little bit and figure out what's the next evolution of the tool, or what does that next evolution of the tool look like? Because as you've gone in your career, Mark, from your your C and C++ days to .NET and so forth, we're still on a WinForm world here. So it's kind of wondering what does that next evolution look like for the toolbox and for all the tooling and for the community?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? But I think the fact that you started from this simple idea, but you yourselves created sort of an open set of APIs to be able to enable people to solve whatever problem necessary, right? Both in the concept of connecting back to dynamic CRM, but also in building, not constraining them to building tools a certain way, right? Giving them a blank canvas, if you will, with some parameters and some framework around, solving problems. I think has been part of the success of XrmToolBox, and in very many ways is what will help drive it to that next generation, because people can build all sorts of tools. And so I think if the theme of it sort of evolves to being the Power Platform, I think you'll probably see two things happen, right? You'll see, one, some of the, we've talked about publicly some of the improvements we're trying to make in the new maker experiences, right? In the new Power Platform Admin Center. And so there will be perhaps some capabilities longer term that show up in the service that certain tools in XrmToolBox maybe, some people will still use because they love them, or others will say, you know what, I'll use the stuff that Microsoft's built now because I don't need this plugin, for example. But then there'll be all sorts of new scenarios, right, that I think the community will continue to struggle with. And when people struggle with things, they find solutions to problems. And XrmToolBox, whatever it sort of evolves to be, I hope will continue to be a place where the community can come together and solve those problems to help each other out, right? Not just help themselves, but then help other people who are trying to solve the same problems, until some point, again, I think where Microsoft perhaps, solves that problem in our own experiences, right? But I think there'll always be that delta where there will be problems that need to be solved that Microsoft isn't solving, that, what better than the community to help each other out with, right? And so branding aside, right, I see XrmToolBox as just continuing to be this tool that more and more people need to know about, right? And then B will as Power Platform grows as a community, I think the usage of the toolbox will grow.
Yeah, and I think I know two at least obvious examples of where Microsoft has sort of, I don't know if they were inspired by, but at least just replaced functionality that used to only be in the toolbox. It's the sitemap editor and the view designer, where the new view designer, where you can actually see the sample data or live data in it, and just columns, and of course the sitemap editor. But I tend to still use the sitemap editor in the XrmToolBox, because then I know exactly what I'm doing and what's happening behind the scenes there. But I'm guessing also there will be, but there's two sides to this. I mean, one is the one where Microsoft provides the tools that are becoming obsolete in the toolbox. But also the other side, that, okay, there's a tool that's good enough, or that's sort of make sure that Microsoft doesn't have to implement this in their own platform as fast as they might have done if it wasn't there.
Yeah, and I think that challenge, right? In designing anything, there's always a balance between sort of simplicity, right, and enabling advanced, capability, and and there's a spectrum of simplicity to complexity, and giving people power, access to the more advanced power that anything is capable of, right? And so if you think about sort of the product group's no cliffs philosophy, where they want the Power Platform to be something that is both approachable to the citizen developer, power user, business analyst persona, right, as well as the professional developer, that's actually a pretty daunting challenge, right, is to make something that is approachable to all of those things, because as you go left to right on that spectrum, people want more access to knobs and controls. And so, frankly, I think, the XrmToolBox and the simple realization of somebody going, oh, Microsoft's experience isn't what I need, or it's not as advanced as I need, or I'm just going to build my own tool until Microsoft does something, it sort of is the essence of the brilliance of XrmToolBox and the community around it, because people who know the APIs can then just go and build what they think they need, and until Microsoft builds something that's that advanced, you now have a tool to enable you to do it. And so I think especially for the advanced administration, professional developer types, there'll always be a place where perhaps the simplicity that we put through in some of our maker experiences, and even some of the advanced sort of knobs, if you will, aren't enough for people, and people will always want to do something a little bit more advanced. And so tools will be born to do those more advanced things as new features are introduced, et cetera.
Yeah.
So Mark, I'm going to switch topics a little bit here. So obviously you're a user, and I may even be on the edge here saying fanboy of the XrmToolBox, but what are your top 3 tools, or if you're thinking it's just of the XrmToolBox plugins that you use or that you promote?
So it's still the ribbon editor, and I'm delighted that it's part of XrmToolBox now, right? Because it's having that one-stop shop, for all the advanced tools, versus having to go, install a CRM solution package and then go to the web UI, right? That was one of the conveniences for me of the ribbon editor being brought into XrmToolBox. I also use, I forget the name of it, but it's one of the tools that makes building Power BI reports, more advanced Power BI reports on top of CDS or XRM easier. I use the sitemap editor when I want to do more advanced things, because I still think in my understanding of how sitemap XML works, and how it works low level. And so for me, cognitively, it's easier when I'm trying to do more advanced things to use the sitemap editor in XrmToolBox. I use some of the web resource tools when I just want to kind of quickly, in a more advanced way, look at web resources and pull down web resources and upload web resources and that sort of thing. But I also use a lot of, when I'm in Visual Studio, I use a lot of tools like Scott Durow's Sparkle, right? The task runner. I use Jason Latimer's add-ins to Visual Studio, because frankly, at least in our current state, they're way better than the beta tool that we have available for people to download from Visual Studio Marketplace. But those are the XrmToolBox tools that I think I would say I probably use the most.
Okay.
Well, then I have to shout out here. We had Jason Latimer on the show recently, and he said he really needs someone to take custody over the developer toolings for Visual Studio, or he's going to drop it. So any takers on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I heard that. I listened to all the XrmToolCast and all the general podcasts that are in the CRM audio series as much as I can. They're all on my sort of backlog of podcasts to listen to, and I was a little bit deflated to hear that, because I think it's an amazing tool that's filled a gap that unfortunately we haven't filled yet. I know there's announcements in our April release that Visual Studio tooling is coming, but frankly, it's yet to be determined how our tools compare to how Jason's tools have evolved. And so, I would echo the sentiment that if there are people out there that love Jason's add-in and don't want to see it, die, right, that consider becoming a contributor, right? Because frankly, there's room in the world for Microsoft first-party tools as well as community tools, and there's choice is great, right? And if you see something in a community tool that you think Microsoft should put in their tool, that's one feedback mechanism. But in some cases, there's preference, right? Some people like to write code in VS Code. Some people like, command line tools. Some people like to write code in Visual Studio and like, GUIs and that sort of thing. And so none of these things are ever one size fits all, right? So I would encourage people who love Jason's tool to consider contributing to keep it going.
Yeah, and even though we have some vague promises about developer tooling for the April release, you didn't hear me say this, but we've heard that before, haven't we?
No, certainly. I understand that. I am one of those people who've been clamoring for our Visual Studio add-in to come out of its perpetual beta for however many years that it's been in, and I frankly have candidly said to my own customers, hey, this is the state of our Visual Studio tools. I'm not here to defend it, but if you want to be productive, here's some amazing community tools. Go use them.
Yeah.
So what's the kind of a final question here, Mark? What's the next tool that needs to be made? What are we missing?
Oh, the next tool that needs to be made. Oh gosh, that's a tough one. Honestly, nothing is jumping at me right now.
Mark lives in a perfect world.
You stumped me.
Except for the name. The name isn't perfect.
But it's interesting. The name one, honestly, as we've gone through this discussion, right, I'm not necessarily of a strong opinion that it needs to be renamed right now, because brand awareness is important. And so, I think continuing to call it XrmToolBox for the time being, but then enhancing all of the sort of the web page and the GitHub project and places where it calls out Dynamics 365 and CRM to in a consumable way to point out the fact that it is a tool for Power Apps and CDS as well, perhaps is the right step in the direction of how it may be rebranded over time, right? Because just like we admit at Microsoft that this Power Platform is on a journey, right? And not everything is changing tomorrow. I think that's a reasonable approach for XrmToolBox as well. In fact, I love it when, whether you like it or not, Ryan Cunningham says in most of his presentations that he does publicly, that we took this thing called Power Apps and this thing called XRM, we smashed them together, put a purple logo on it, and said they're all part of one platform now. But the reality is that was just a step in a direction that we're heading. And I think what you're starting to see over time, over the course of subsequent releases, and we'll see more in the April release, and then we'll see even more in the October release, is that those seams between Power Apps Flow and what used to be CDS and XRM, which is now part of Power Apps as CDS, and then Model Driven, which is part of Power Apps, those seams will start to disappear because they're on a journey. And so I think very similarly, everyone should take a pragmatic approach in what they're doing and aspire to have those seams disappear over time equally, right? Frankly, I think that the community has always been a little bit more agile and forward-thinking, right? Because of the agility that the community projects have over sort of shipping formal Microsoft releases. So perhaps the community can pioneer this shift in terminology and welcoming more people into the quote-unquote XRM fold who don't even know that they're part of the XRM fold, because the only terms that they know are Power Apps, Model Driven, and CDS, right? But really have this wealth of resources out there to take advantage of if they just could connect the dots between CDS and XRM, right?
Yeah. So maybe we should be clear, we're not the ones deciding on this, of course. It's Tanguy Tessard, who is the godfather of XrmToolBox. But so we're just discussing the different alternatives that we see here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also want to add that, okay, let's say 6 months from now, we make the big switch. It's now the Power Platform Toolbox. And 6 months after that, Microsoft rebrands again. So just to sit still in the boat.
Yeah, the only thing that's guaranteed is that you can't predict the future, right? Like the change is inevitable, right? It's funny, like people always ask, well, can you guarantee licensing's not going to change or branding's not going to change? And I said, my answer is I wish I could, but what do they say with the stock market? Like past performance is not indicative of future results or something like that. And I think it's just kind of reality, right? I hope, as this terminology is resonating with people, and it is in my experience, I hope that we've landed on a brand that will stick for a while. But if I could predict the future, I probably would be on a beach somewhere.
Yes.
Those are some good final words here.
Yeah, some good final words to live by. So I'm going to end with a deep thought by Jack Handey and about Mark's perfect world, because I can imagine a perfect world without hate, world without fear, world without anger. And then I could picture us attacking that world because they'd never expect it.
There you go.
It's a deep thought by Jack Candy. So, well, Mark, thanks for joining us. Thanks for the discussion and your issue on GitHub that is still open, by the way. So it looks like there hasn't been any final word on it one way or the other. Although I think the issue really became, hey, let's change some of the documentation, some of the splash screens and stuff, but keep the name. I think that was kind of we've currently are settling on in that aspect. But yeah, I really appreciate reaching out and getting involved with the community, even as a Microsoftie.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Jonas, if they want to talk to us, how do they get a hold of us?
Well, they should find the Twitter handle XrmToolCast, or they should email us at cast@XrmToolBox.com.
And if anyone wants to send you anything, Mark, how can they get a hold of you?
You can email me. So my Twitter handle is devkedet. And I guess I probably don't want to give my email address out on a podcast. That might flood my inbox.
Then you can at least explain your Twitter handle, because I've been thinking about that.
Yeah, so my Twitter handle, I am a developer at heart, so that's where dev comes from. And I went to a college in Virginia called the Virginia Military Institute, and the mascot for the Virginia Military Institute is a kedet, which ironically, the mascot is actually a kangaroo. And the word kedet comes from, at least the folklore is that the word kedet comes from the southern drawl of pronouncing the word cadet, which is what you are when you're at a military college.
All right.
So I am Dev Kedet. Now,
Wow.
That's a bunch of useless information, but you asked.
And
I asked, and I excused myself for not realizing that before you explained it.
Yes. And I think this goes back to the whole beginning of the show. Naming things is hard. So,
That's right.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Please give
Thanks.
some feedback for any future episodes or comments, concerns. Thanks.
This has been the XrmToolCast from CRM Audio with Jonas Rapp and Daryl Labar. Do you have questions for Jonas and Daryl or suggestions for future episodes? Send it to cast@XrmToolBox.com. This is a production of Dynamics Podcast LLC.